Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We are going to give it just a minute for folks to log on and we will get started. Thanks so much for being here. All right. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Kim Johnson. I'm the policy manager here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And this, of course, is NLIHC's National House Campaign Call for Universal, Stable, and Affordable Housing. This is going to be our last call of the year, so we will be on a hiatus until January 16th, which is a Tuesday after Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which is when we will return. So we'll look forward to seeing you all then. But we do have a great lineup prepared for you today. We'll be joined by Sonia Acosta from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who has updated estimates for the funding that will be required to renew all existing housing vouchers in FY24. We'll also be joined by Ryan Finnegan from the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of California, Berkeley, who will discuss a collaborative study on the importance of well-resourced targeted assistance for people experiencing homelessness. Dr. Mary Patillo from Northwestern University will share findings from a new report on the role of housing in reducing intergenerational poverty. We will receive field updates from Gina Wilt at the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio and Monique Blossom from the Louisiana Fair Housing Center. And of course, we will close, as we always do, with a policy update and call to action. So it's my pleasure to introduce now my incredible colleague, Sonia Acosta, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center on Budget Policy Priorities. Sonia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kim, and happy to be with you all today. Thanks for having me, NLIHC, to talk about some updated estimates for voucher renewals. So the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities had previously provided some estimates about what would be needed and how many vouchers would be lost under both the Senate and the House proposals. But we got some new data from HUD, and based on that new data, we are estimating that the funding level in the House appropriations bill would cause about 112,000 fewer households to receive help in 2024. And the Senate bill, which provides more funding, would mean 80,000 fewer families are served. So that's significantly more than what we had previously shared, which was 60,000 and 8,000. But this new data kind of is a big increase, and it's really coming from the program catching up to the steep rent increases in 2022. So even though for the most part rents have really stabilized this year, because of the way that HUD calculates subsidy caps or fair market rents, there's still some catching up to do in the program. And so the program needs more funding just to maintain existing assistance for people receiving vouchers. So why is this important? I think a lot of people on this call know, but people left without rental assistance are far more likely to experience homelessness, overcrowding, be at risk of eviction, or any other form of housing instability. These cuts would disproportionately harm people of color, particularly Black and Latina households, who are more likely to be eligible for rental assistance because of historical and ongoing discrimination in housing, education, employment, and other fields. And we know that even with existing funding, the program does not help everyone who is eligible. Only, let's see, we have 3 in 4 households who need help don't receive it, and there are long wait lists across the country and people often have to wait years before they receive a voucher. We also saw recently new data from HUD that was released on Friday around homelessness and showing the point in time count for 2023, and saw that homelessness rose sharply, which really just demonstrates that what we need is more rental assistance and not less. So what's kind of the ask of this is that Congress needs to provide more money to ensure that we are able to serve the same number of families. You know, one thing I want to make clear about these numbers. So under the House bill, what they proposed, it would be 112 fewer households. That doesn't mean that 112,000 people would lose assistance. What's much more likely is that housing agencies just wouldn't be able to reissue vouchers once a family left the program, which is better than people outright losing assistance. But I think it's really important to remember that this is already a program that doesn't serve everyone who needs it. And it's incredibly difficult to regain vouchers once they've been lost. There was sequestration back in 2013, where we saw a deep cuts to the voucher program, and we lost many vouchers. And it took a very long time to try to get back to just that same level. And we can see from, what the new data from HUD around homelessness, that this assistance is needed by more people now. So that's kind of the gist of it. And if Kim hasn't already shared in the chat, I see she's been putting a lot of links, but we did put together just a tweet thread that kind of goes through this. And so I can make sure that folks have that as well, but also happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you for joining. One question that really pops to mind, and you touched on this too, with the new AHAR report that's come out, there have been so many just consistent calls from, in particular, members of the House Freedom Caucus, those far-right folks who want to see massive spending cuts across the board, but especially to domestic programs and especially to programs that serve people with low incomes, including housing. And so those pushes have really severely limited spending negotiations for FY24. We're operating under that agreement, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, that caps what we can spend this year and next. And we're seeing this drastic increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness because of the increased cost of rent, because of stagnant wages, because of the pandemic assistance running out, and Congress failing to provide the resources necessary to actually address these problems. So what impact, if Congress doesn't manage to actually provide the funding that is needed to ensure there's adequate funding for these voucher renewals, what is that going to do to kind of the number of people experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity moving forward?
Yeah, so all of that is absolutely right. And I think there are kind of two different aspects to the impact. So one, there's the immediate impact of, 80,000 to 112,000 people who, instead of receiving assistance, are on a wait list, and they continue to potentially experience homelessness, to be at risk of eviction, to live in overcrowded or unsafe conditions. And without any sort of other help, their living situation may in fact worsen. So there's those immediate impacts on people by underfunding this program and not providing them the assistance that they need. But there's also the longer term impacts of, okay, so now we're serving fewer people. And it's not like next year, again, we have more budget caps. It's not like next year we're just going to be able to provide enough funding to catch up again. And we may even have to continue to fight against the loss of more vouchers. And that's just going to build over time, and fewer people are going to receive assistance in proportion to the number of people who need it. You know, the increases in rents have increased how much the voucher program costs. But the increases in rents have also increased the number of people who need a housing voucher because incomes have just not caught up to the high increases in rents that we've seen. So Congress really needs to prioritize making sure that we can at least maintain this program. What we really need is substantial investments in rental assistance, in increasing the supply of affordable housing, and all of these housing programs that fit together and work to ensure that people with the lowest incomes have a safe and affordable place to live.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sonia. And a question that came in, just like a question kind of around how perceptions of voucher holders have really impacted PHA's ability to lease up vouchers and potentially HUD's willingness to reissue vouchers, or Congress's willingness to invest more in the voucher program. Is there anything that you would kind of like say to that, or any insights that you would have on that?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of prejudices out there against just people with low incomes, and assumptions about who they are as tenants or how they will act. I know, but I will say that in the past year, housing agencies have done, with some help from HUD, housing agencies and HUD together have made some really great progress in increasing the number of people who are served through this program. Last year was a lot more difficult, in part because the rental market was so difficult. HUD took steps to adjust the fair market rents and make it easier for families to use vouchers in the private market. But also there was additional technical assistance and additional incentives that housing agencies offered to landlords to participate in the program. And they've done a great job in helping. I don't have the number right in front of me, but it's, you know, tens of thousands of additional households this past year compared to last year, which is just really great. So I think that work is really important, and the work of advocates is also clearly really important in this, and changing the narrative around who these people are, why they are good tenants, why the voucher program is actually can be really helpful for a landlord because it guarantees that they're going to get paid every month. So lifting up some of those narratives and pushing back against harmful ones, I think, is a really important aspect of what advocates can do, as well as folks like me and Kim talking to people on the Hill.
Definitely. And, you know, just to add to that too, in the long term, pushing for protections like protections from source of income discrimination to ensure that voucher holders can use their vouchers in communities of their choice, and not be rejected because they are paying the rent voucher. So one more quick question, and then we'll let you get on with the rest of your day. Will we be able to look forward to an updated methodology or analysis from the Center on Budget with these new estimates?
So that really depends. This data, you know, came kind of towards the end of the year when a lot of our team are taking time off to rest and recover, and we want to honor that. And so we may not be putting out like a full blog like we have previously done. It really depends too on what Congress is up to at the beginning of the new year. You can sign up for the center's housing newsletter, because we just sent one out this morning that has some updated information there. But as far as resources to use right now, the tweet thread that Kim shared in there that comes from our Vice President of Housing and Income Security, Peggy Bailey, does kind of lay out some of this information. And if you have questions about where this is coming from, please feel free to reach out to me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat to where folks can register for those updates from the Center on Budget. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights and expertise. And yeah, feel free to stick around if you want, but also might have other things to do than listen to us. So thank you again for joining.
Thanks for having me. Have a happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, or thank you, Sonia. So now we are going to turn to Ryan Finnegan, Associate Research Director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Ryan, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. So let me see, I'm trying to figure out how to control the slides here. Sorry. My technical savvy is outpaced by your advanced system.
You know, we really try to stay on the cutting edge here at NLHC. Oh, there we go.
Oh, I think hopefully I am the one controlling this. Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry about that, everyone. Pleasure to get to speak with you all and share some findings from our work in California today. Over the past couple of years, the Turner Center at UC Berkeley, along with our partners at UCSF's Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative and Apt Associates, have been doing an assessment of statewide homelessness services, shelter, and housing in collaboration with California's Interagency Council on Homelessness. Before I get into it, I'll just briefly say that anything I express today are my views and not the views of California's Interagency Council. So in our study, we were initially charged with providing a holistic picture of how California had been using state-directed funding to address homelessness and housing issues. Among that broad charge, we were looking at how the state used $9.6 billion of state-directed funding to meet the needs of people at risk of or experiencing homelessness. So we looked at how that funding was directed to different kinds of programs and interventions, but we also looked at how that funding was used to serve populations with distinct needs. And so today I'll just provide a few highlights for how some of these assessments or some of these findings showed what worked best for youth. So people between ages birth and 18 or 18 and 24, families, so households with both adults and dependent children, older adults aged 50 and older, and veterans. And so the data that we rely on was a couple of different main sources. The first were administrative data that were collected from homelessness programs across the state. So programs that received selected state or federal funding, which includes homelessness prevention, street outreach, emergency shelters, and supportive housing programs, reported data to a centralized state system. These are HUD-defined data systems that the Interagency Council in California aggregates. And so we analyzed millions of service records across the years 2018 to 2021. We also conducted hundreds of interviews with program staff and local administrators, as well as 80 interviews with people currently or previously experiencing homelessness about their needs and what worked well or not for them. And overall, what we found in these administrative data was that over the course of 3 years, there were 571,000 unique people that were served by homelessness programs. We also found that as the state directed an increasing amount of funding toward homelessness programs, they were able to scale up and serve a growing number of people from one year to the next. Among the people served, we found that about a third were either children or young adults, and about 2/3 were adults over the age of 25 years old. Family status intersected with age in important ways that shaped the kinds of programs people had access to and their needs. So while 90+% of children were served as part of a family with an adult, most young adults were served in the absence of adults over the age of 25 or not in a family of their own. In contrast, most adults over the age of 25 were served as single adults, meaning that they were not with dependent children in their household. And when we look among people that were at least 18 years old, 40% were at least age 50. And particularly for folks experiencing homelessness, it comes with advanced weathering. So increased rates of physical or mental health needs and disabilities that require special service attention. And so one of the key highlights that we see when we looked across the different populations served and types of programs that were supported by state and federal funding, we saw that people were housed more often when there were more resources directed towards serving that population, and specifically when those resources and programs were tailored to their distinctive needs. So what you're seeing here is just a snapshot of the data. So we looked at the data within a 3-year window. And so this is the percentage of people and families or adults age 25 and older that at the end of our snapshot of the data were recorded as housed. I would not interpret these percentages as program effectiveness. Many of the people who were not recorded as housed at the end of this 3-year window continued to be served by homelessness programs and might have become housed shortly after the end of our observation period. But what we saw was that about twice the percentage of families compared to single adults were housed at the end of the period. There are many differences between people and families and adult individuals in terms of age, in terms of the kinds of needs that they might have and the programs that they have access to. But one of the consistent things that we heard from practitioners across the state was simply that the resources were less inadequate for serving families than they were for serving single adults. And so we heard from practitioners things like our local system has been committed to making sure that we have permanent housing resources for families above and beyond things like shelter resources. And that in part, it was because the political will for serving families is simply stronger than the political will for serving single adults. And we can see that when we break out the data in terms of the types of programs that families and adult individuals were served by. So we saw that there were housing programs, including homelessness prevention programs, that reached a much higher share of families in the data compared to adult individuals. For example, rapid rehousing programs, which provide a short-term, time-limited rental assistance subsidy along with some form of housing navigation support, served almost half of the families in the administrative data, compared to only about 16% of adult individuals. Almost a quarter of families in the data were served by a homelessness prevention program, the overwhelming majority of whom did not experience literal homelessness while observed during this study. In contrast, only about 7% of adult individuals were served by prevention programs. Instead, the level of need is much, much greater for adult individuals, most of whom were experiencing literal homelessness, sleeping on the street, in emergency shelters, vehicles, tents, or other places not meant for habitation. And that's reflected by the high shares of adult individuals for whom their program enrollments were in emergency shelters or in street outreach. Even among adult individuals, so not people in families, we saw better housing outcomes among veterans than among non-veterans. So the majority of veterans were housed or were enrolled in a housing program that they had yet to be moved into and placed in permanently, rather than about a third of non-veteran adult individuals. And again, research has shown this before. There has been great strides in reducing veteran homelessness across both California and the rest of the nation. Over the last 10 years, veteran homelessness has been reduced by about 41%. And in talking with providers across the state, several told us that the concerted resources available for serving veterans, including things like the HUD-VASH program, helped them reach, quote, functional zero with veterans, meaning that the capacity of local systems to house the number of veterans experiencing homelessness at any given point could keep that functionally at zero, meaning that people were housed at roughly the same rate they entered homelessness. And again, that we see that these higher resources for veterans were concentrated in permanent housing programs or programs that show high success in leading to permanent housing outcomes. So rapid rehousing programs served about 44% of the veterans in the data. Supportive housing programs, so pairing deeply affordable housing with supportive services, includes about 29% of the veterans that we observed in our data. But then also transitional housing programs that provide about 2 years of temporary housing along with supportive services and other kinds of case management and programming served over a fifth of the veterans of the data. And so these sorts of resources that come from Veterans Affairs, HUD, and other kinds of state and local programs have been vital for securing better housing outcomes. But we also heard from practitioners across the state that implementation was really key here. And one of the practitioners that we interviewed, who echoed the sentiments of many others, described what the VA is doing to help house veterans between a combination of subsidies and supportive services as a model for how local systems should be supporting adult individuals. So not only are these programs well integrated, but they said that the VA and these other federal programs that are working in coordination with the VA listen to their grantees. They said that they actually listened to what worked well and what the challenges were. They took that information in, consolidated it, lobbied Congress for program changes and funding necessary to implement the programs well, and they believe that that's how they were able to see results. So the lessons for serving adult individuals better were both about the scale of resources needed, but also about program implementation as well. Beyond the importance of resources for housing people well, we also saw in the data that gender, race, and ethnicity and sexual orientation deeply shape how people experience programs, what their needs are, and then there are implications for equity across these different dimensions when we're investing or implementing programs in particular ways for particular populations. So the numbers shown on this slide here are that there is a larger share of people who identified as female, particularly among adults and families and among younger folks, versus when you're looking among single adults who are reaching older ages, they are much more likely to identify as male. Similarly, in part reflecting the demographics of the state of California, people in families were much more likely to identify as people of color, as were younger people compared to older people. But there are other ways that we see these characteristics intersecting in ways that have implications for equity. So for example, just a couple of the statistics that we pulled out. One is that young adults that are unaccompanied by parents or other adults age 25 and or older were about 4.5 times more likely than older single adults to identify as trans or as gender nonconforming. That reflects the impacts of stigma and discrimination and parental rejection as a driver of youth homelessness. We also saw that among young adults with their own children, so people 18 to 24 with their own kids, about 88% were young women of color. And so how we target resources to these populations will then have effects on how equitably we're serving people across age, race, gender, family status. And then we heard from practitioners as well about the specific kinds of needs and skills that are important for serving people in these different intersections equitably and well. Youth providers repeatedly described the importance of serving youth in dedicated programs for youth. Programs that served people of all ages were often not welcoming for youth, or they felt sometimes unsafe when they were in a program that mixed older adults and teens. And so they also highlighted the need for addressing developmental stages and trauma that come with working in youth. People serving older adults highlighted the need for much greater health supports, including physical accessibility. So many providers working in emergency shelters or housing projects told us that there weren't enough ADA supports for older adults. One person that we talked to who was experiencing unsheltered homelessness said that unsheltered homelessness exacerbated her health needs. She said that she had spinal challenges and was feeling like just in pain all the time. And so one of the outreach workers that we were working with throughout this study was talking about how they had opened a new shelter for them. And as they were building this new shelter, they were increasing the level of ADA supports available in the shelter because they knew that the population they were serving was much older. But we also saw that there's much more work to be done. One example was that the many local systems across the state were looking at their data for racial equity, or rather inequity, in terms of who they were serving in their different programs and the outcomes for the people that they serve. And they often describe that data as a wake-up call. It's not that they didn't think that their services were in some way potentially inequitable, but the hard numbers behind it gave it more power and more motivation to address. And so many of the people that we talked with were in the early stages still of revising their program implementation and understanding how do they translate awareness of inequities into solutions. And finally, what we found was that there was a clear need for sustained and well-targeted resources. Again, I think that was not a surprise to anyone that we worked with in this study. Clearly, California's homelessness crisis calls for big action. But we also found that there was a need for greater information and evidence-based foundations for understanding where those resources should go and the kinds of programs that they support. One of the big tensions in the state at the moment is around the balance of resources dedicated toward temporary shelter versus permanent housing. And particularly in terms of the political pressures to, quote, do something across the state, many of our stakeholders and the elected officials that we've spoken with feel strong pressure from the public to build more shelter to reduce unsheltered visible homelessness. But practitioners often noted that when you do that, you're not necessarily investing in long-term solutions. And in fact, putting more resources toward temporary shelter can undermine investment in long-term resources. And so they said things like, if you do more prevention and more permanent housing, you don't need more shelter. And this kind of sentiment was echoed by people experiencing homelessness that we spoke with as well. When we interviewed one woman, we asked her what would help you exit homelessness in ways that programs are not currently able to provide. And what she said was, what would help is if you guys find the land and build the housing, build and build and build them, house the people and get them indoors. And actually, as I was interviewing her, she started pointing at lots that she said were county-owned land. And she said, there is no reason that you shouldn't build housing there. I told her, I unfortunately don't control county lands, but I'm happy to advocate on her behalf for counties to allocate their lands in that way. And so that's just a few of the highlights. You can see, I put a link in the chat here, an overview of a series of reports that we've written that pull out some of these highlights and provide some of the same information that I was just describing. But there's much more to the study in a series of reports that's still ongoing. I'm also happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining. We did have a couple great questions come in while you were presenting. You mentioned, the issues around compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and just the continuous issue of the availability of affordable, accessible housing and shelter and services. And so one of the questions that came in was, do you have any stats on the number of people, with disabilities who are served by these important programs you were observing?
Yeah, absolutely. We have it in our series of reports that's out. Off the top of my head, I'm not remembering some specific statistics except for a couple. One is that we did see much higher rates of people experiencing chronic patterns of homelessness, measured by experiencing homelessness for at least a cumulative year in the previous 3 years, plus the presence of a disabling condition, including mental health challenges or substance use challenges. Among those stats, Older adults, so age 50 plus, 40% of them were experiencing chronic homelessness during our observation window. And among those older adults with these disabling health conditions, only 25% lived in a supportive housing program during that window. So there's clearly a very high level of need, and clearly that high level of need is vastly outpacing the resources available to address it.
Definitely. And unfortunately, even just going back to Sonia's presentation, over and over again, we see the underfunding of these solutions that we know work and that are helpful to helping people find housing, but with just not enough funding. Another really interesting question that came in too, let me see if I can find it right quick. It disappeared in the chat. How encompassing do you think the HDIS data is? So for example, in our CalWorks program alone, many families are homeless and are served by the program, and some are never referred to the continuums of care. So they're not listed in the HDIS.
Yeah, good question. So HDIS includes most, but not all services for people experiencing homelessness. So the data include all people served by HUD-funded programs and most people served by most state-directed funding sources. So things that are left out include survivors of domestic violence, because those are a protected class, so the data are not visible for their confidentiality. I think there was one question about the CalWorks. CalWorks does now require reporting to the same data system. So people receiving those forms of assistance, even though they're not referred to the continuum of care, are reflected in these data. What they often miss are the relatively smaller programs that are philanthropically and privately funded. And so there are many forms of survival services and emergency shelters that are run out of church basements, or that are pop-up services in church parking lots, or mobile shower vans. These kinds of services that aren't receiving large amounts of state or federal funding are typically left out, but they're also pretty vital for the survival of people living outside.
Definitely. Thank you, Ryan. So one last question, and then we'll let you get on with your day. So a question came in, I believe, in a Wall Street Journal article. They said there's about a 17-year delay in building affordable housing in California due to regulations and laws. Are you familiar with this? And are these things that policy changes through ballot measures would be able to help address in order to get more housing built?
Yeah, good question. I'm not familiar with the specific year estimate, but the Turner Center has done some work on, it's actually passed through the state legislature and signed by the governor. There are many kinds of streamlining regulations that have been coming down in order to reduce the complexity and time that it takes to get affordable housing, including supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness, entitled and approved. Most of it is focused on entitlement thus far. So for example, there was a handful of streamlining measures that help supportive projects and affordable projects that are in urbanized areas bypass some of the burdensome red tape around local discretionary review or environmental impact reviews. And that significantly speeds up and increases the certainty of these projects being entitled. At the same time, there are a lot of headwinds that are beyond the control of these streamlining regulations. Things like rising costs for construction, in particular, have been a major hurdle for getting these projects kind of the shovels in the ground and getting them up and running and people moved in. So there are more efforts to continue to make it easier, faster, and more cost-effective to build. But there are a lot of headwinds that all have to be addressed. There's unfortunately no silver bullet for doing that.
Definitely. Yeah, it's definitely a very complex puzzle. I wish there was a silver bullet to fix all of it, but unfortunately not. But we will keep on advocating for the myriad of solutions that we know help. Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining and for sharing all of your insights. And we will have to have you back as the Turner Center continues this wonderful series.
Thank you so much. It was a privilege.
All right. And so now I am going to welcome to the screen, I guess, Dr. Patillo. Dr. Patillo is the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Department of Black Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Patillo, thank you so much for joining and sharing your research with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and there's lots of synergies across what we've just heard and what I'll be presenting. So I'll be presenting on a national consensus report done by the National Academies of Science and called Reducing Intergenerational Poverty. The report was authored by an interdisciplinary committee across the social sciences, psychology, economics, sociology, with people with expertise in immigration and race and ethnicity, in many fields that are relevant for intergenerational poverty. The report was commissioned by a US congressional mandate to study the causes and potential solutions to intergenerational poverty. It comes on the heels of a study on child poverty. And so this is different in that we are focused on poverty from one generation to the next. And our mandate was to study the key drivers of intergenerational poverty, to look at evidence-based policies and programs that can reduce intergenerational poverty, to specifically investigate the racial and ethnic disparities and structural factors that are behind intergenerational poverty, and then finally to talk about gaps in the data and research. Just to be clear about how we defined intergenerational poverty, it's a situation in which children who grow up in families with incomes below the poverty line are themselves poor as adults. So as you can see from this definition, we always need long-term data in order to understand intergenerational poverty, because you have to start when a child is young in a family below the poverty line and then observe that child as an adult, whatever that could be 20 years later, and assess their income as below the poverty line to document intergenerational poverty. The data show that about 34% of children in the US who grew up in or near the poverty line, here our measure is really low income. We have a couple of measures that I can talk about in the Q&A, but about 34% of kids who grow up low income are also themselves low income as adults. So kids born around 1980, then observed in their 30s, about 34% were basically persistently poor. And this is about 2 times the rate found for children who did not grow up poor. So children who did not grow up poor, about 17% of them were poor as adults. This intergenerational persistence of low-income status is, as you might imagine, differentially experienced by race and ethnicity. And so here we see that compared to white children who grew up poor, Asian American children were less likely to be poor as adults than white children, Latino children somewhat less likely than white children, and Black and Native American children considerably more likely than white children to be poor as adults. So about nearly half of Native American children who were low income as children were also low income as adults. The report goes through 7 different drivers of persistent poverty across generations. We look at education, at health, at income, wealth and employment, at family structure, at housing and neighborhoods, at safety in the criminal legal system, and at child welfare. Of course, I'll be focusing here on housing and neighborhoods. These are ordinal numbers, but in the report, if you look at it, and actually perhaps I should put the, nope, that's, well, hopefully somebody can put the link in the chat, or I'll do that during the Q&A. This is chapter 8 in the report. The housing and neighborhoods chapter is chapter 8. Let me just put this in the chat. There we go. Okay, so thinking about housing, as we know, housing is a complex bundle. So housing itself is the unit, is the quality of the unit, is the affordability of the unit, but housing is also nestled within neighborhoods. And in neighborhoods, everything from parks to local businesses to public safety and all manner of things are related to the housing unit being nestled within those neighborhoods. And I'll talk about both. So we go through a number of characteristics of housing, household crowding we show, and this is really a review of the existing literature. So basically you can look at this part of the report as really a citation-rich understanding of the relationship between housing and intergenerational poverty, especially the impacts of housing on children. So household crowding interrupts children's study, sleep, and play. Household quality affects children's cognitive and social development and economic outcomes. Household stability is harmful. Household instability, meaning frequent moves, is harmful for children's educational attainment, health, and delinquency. And household affordability, or the lack thereof, basically we find this, the research finds this U-shaped relationship. So very low cost housing and very high cost housing relative to a family's income is associated with poor educational performance for children. We also look specifically at homelessness, and the research shows that being unhoused is negatively associated with children's education and health outcomes, such as high school graduation rates and on adult employment. Most of this research is correlational. So in a minute, I'll talk about our evidence standards in terms of the kinds of things, ideas that we came up with in the housing realm and in the neighborhood realm that might improve children's outcomes in the long term. And most of this research is correlational and also on short-term outcomes for children. So many of the things I just mentioned are on short-term outcomes. And to study intergenerational poverty, you have to observe children into their adulthood. On the neighborhood front, lead exposure, both in the housing unit, but also through pollution and through ground soil, is very negatively associated with children's educational outcomes, with their occupational status, and with their income. And then neighborhoods are also the sites of public safety concerns. So concentrated poverty, for example, increases young people's exposure to violence, and exposure to violence is correlated with children's educational, labor market, and delinquency outcomes, and also actually with intergenerational poverty. As I mentioned, we had a particular charge to look at racial and ethnic disparities in all of these drivers and to look at possible ways to specifically focus interventions to ameliorate these disparities. And so I'll just go somewhat quickly through the various domains in which we see racial and ethnic disparities in the housing world. So first, as I just mentioned, poverty concentration is negatively correlated with intergenerational mobility or positively correlated with intergenerational poverty. And we see that living in a neighborhood of high poverty is more frequent for Black and Native American children, much more frequent for Black and Native American children, somewhat more frequent for Latino children compared to, again, white children. And white and Asian children have the lowest frequency of living in high poverty neighborhoods. Basically, almost a fourth of Black and Native American children live in high poverty neighborhoods. In terms of housing quality, here I'm referring specifically to inadequate housing, which is defined by severe or moderate physical problems, plumbing problems, heating deficiencies, rodent or cockroach infestations, and so on and so forth. It's not a very widespread experience, but it's much more common for Native American families, for example, 10% of whom live in inadequate housing as compared to 4% of white and Asian American families. Housing cost burden. Here we have two sets of statistics. The top panel shows by income, and the bottom panel, three actually sets of statistics. The middle panel shows by race, and the bottom panel shows by renter or home ownership status. And to focus, since our focus here is on low-income families, we find that, and we show that over 70% of families who have incomes below $30,000 are housing cost burdened, either moderately or severely. By race, we see that Black families are the most likely to be housing cost burdened, with over 40% of Black families experiencing basically paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. And then renters are more likely to be housing cost burdened than homeowners. Homeownership rates also show racial disparities. Again, here we have by income and by race simultaneously. So the middle panel shows it for low income, white, Asian, Latino, Black, and Native American families. And the bottom shows by moderate income or moderate and upper income. But if you just look at the top panel, you basically see that white homeownership rates outpace all other racial and ethnic groups, with Black homeownership rates being the lowest. We look at policies that might improve families' likelihood of boosting their children out of poverty as they become adults. And here's where I want to highlight our evidence standard. So we had two high bar evidence standards. So the first is that there is direct evidence of a program or policy that has long run outcomes into adulthood. So this is a program or policy that a child experienced that we could then observe that child's outcome when they were adults. And the second evidence standard is that there is strong evidence, which we define as having causal evidence that a policy or program improved some correlate of adult poverty. It might be earnings or schooling or health or criminal legal contact. So when you add these two things together, there is very little research actually that we could draw on in the housing world to come up with ideas for interventions. Most of the research focuses on children's outcomes, not their outcomes when they are adults. And most of the research is correlational rather than causal. To have causal evidence, we often need either a randomized controlled trial or some type of quasi-experimental research design that can get at causality. Nonetheless, we still have a number of areas in the housing and neighborhoods world that we put forth as ideas. And the first dovetails in the other direction of the first presenter that we heard. So while Congress is decreasing the number of housing choice vouchers, we put forth the idea of increasing the number of housing choice vouchers and coupling it with customized counseling and case management services to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. And so we particularly highlight the family stability. I'm going to blank on what it FSOVA, but I'm blanking on exactly what that stands for. But I'm sure you all, the Family Stability and Opportunities Voucher Act. We talk about that in the report. There we go. And then there is indirect evidence that expanding the Housing Choice Voucher Program, even without case management services to move people to high opportunity neighborhoods, could positively impact children in the long term. We don't have those long-term studies, but we have studies in the short term that are promising for children's long-term outcomes. And then in the neighborhoods world, because violent crime is so correlated with negative outcomes in the long term, we talk about strengthening communities to reduce violent crime through various kinds of neighborhood investment programs, such as abating vacant lots and abandoned homes and increasing grants to community-based organizations. And there are even some policing strategies that show positive impacts, especially in reducing homicide victimization that we put forth in the report. And then finally, reducing pollution. Pollution is something that is very clearly connected to long-term negative outcomes for children, especially low-income children. And low-income children are more likely to be exposed to pollution. And so we have a number of ideas here to reduce pollution in low-income neighborhoods, which should improve kids' possibilities of moving out of poverty. We'd like to thank the study sponsors that are listed here. And with that, I will wrap up and open it up for questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Patillo, for sharing all of that and for all of the incredible research that you're doing on the importance of housing and stable, quality, affordable housing for all of those long-term outcomes that we were talking about, and for moving families out of a cycle of intergenerational poverty that can be so difficult to break. Just a quick question that came into the chat for around just not logistics, but I guess what's methodology. How did you define adults in your study?
So yeah, adults were simply over age 18. In fact, that meant that we had a lot more proposals in the education domain than in some of the other domains, because high school interventions, for example, then if you observed a child who was in high school, say 4 years later, then we could look at those outcomes 4 years later. So we definitely thought of college completion, for example, as an indicator of moving out of poverty.
Thank you so much for answering that. And just wondering too, is there anything in particular that you found in the study that really stands out to you? As you know, we were just talking about there's no silver bullet answer for all of these complex housing problems. But is there anything that really stands out to you as something that Congress can take immediate action on in order to help advance some of these long-term solutions?
Yeah, I think in the housing world, as I mentioned, the idea that we come up with goes in the exact opposite direction that Congress is moving. And so increasing the number of vouchers by 500,000 is the exact opposite direction of the decrease that we heard at the top of the hour by about 122,000. And so they are going in the precisely wrong direction to interrupt cycles of intergenerational poverty, as shown by some of the most rigorous research that exists. So our bar was extremely high. And even that program, the demonstration that I'm referring to was done in Seattle, and that coupling with counseling to move to higher opportunity areas is something that's very cost effective given the benefits that would accrue over the long term. And this is the point we try to make in the report, that intergenerational poverty is costly, you know, that we have a less educated population, that we have a population that is more likely to be involved in the criminal legal system, that we have a population that will cost in the long run through social services. And so investing in children, especially low-income children, to increase their possibilities of not being poor as adults is a long-term cost-saving measure. The one other thing I'll mention is the evidence, the one study that met our criteria for evidence in the homelessness world is the family opportunity study, family option study that has been studied by Apt Associates, and the lead author is Daniel Gubitz there. And this family option study is exactly a randomized controlled trial on homelessness interventions. And it is the long-term voucher offer that improves the outcomes for children who are in families experiencing homelessness. The reason it didn't completely meet our evidence criteria is they only observed the children, I think it was at most 4 years after the initial intervention. And so we didn't have the children as they are adults. But that's the most rigorous evidence of very good outcomes for children and families from a very high quality study.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And one thing that really just stands out to me too is, you know, interventions cost money, sure, but inaction also has its own price. We might not see it immediately, although for a lot of people we do, but not doing anything also costs money. And so why, when given the option of doing something preventative that can help prevent so much pain and hardship, would you choose instead to, like you said, go in the opposite direction and defund these programs that we know help lift people out of poverty?
Totally.
Yeah, just doesn't make a
Yes. Well said.
But thank you so much, Dr. Pastillo, for joining us. We will look forward to having you back on when you come out with your next incredible research report. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
And so we are going to turn now to our field updates. We're going to start out first with an update from Gina Wilt, Advocacy Director at the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio. Gina, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And this has been a great call. I've learned a lot. It's been really, really great. So my name is Gina Wilt, and I am the advocacy director for HoUSed, which many of you maybe are familiar with, but we are a coalition of organizations and individuals committed to ending homelessness and promoting safe, decent, accessible, and fair housing for all people. So we're a statewide advocacy organization. We do continue to focus on helping our lowest income friends and neighbors. And so we advocate for those living in affordable housing, those who need affordable housing, and people experiencing homelessness. So I'm really excited to give a short but special update about what's happening on housing at the Ohio State House. If my friend here will let me, let's see. Sorry. Of course. So we are having a really, really good experience at the Ohio State House right now with the Ohio Senate Select Committee on Housing. And I'll just give you a quick 101 version on this committee. We'll talk a little bit about the committee goals, the testimony, and then finally our advocacy efforts to hopefully amplify the good work happening with this committee. So very quickly on the actual committee, it's a 5-member committee, 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat. The chair of the committee is Senator Michelle Reynolds. She is a Republican from Central Ohio, so she lives near the Columbus area, represents parts of Franklin County and many of the suburbs in our capital city. The committee is unique because the chair has decided to take it on the road. She's doing a road show. So instead of just having regular hearings at the State House around one particular piece of legislation, this committee has been hitting cities across the state. And so the first hearing was in Cincinnati, and then there was a Marietta hearing, and then Lima, and then Cleveland is up next. And then they're also going to be doing some site visits. She's done a few already, and then she plans to do more. So they are hearing all testimony around all things housing, not just affordable housing. It is all things housing. They're not discussing any particular legislation, but they do plan to put together a report on what they have learned. And it's not clear if they'll provide like actual recommendations, but they will put together some report at the end of the process. So some of the committee goals, the committee is trying to learn about barriers to housing and investigate solutions for accessible and affordable housing. So we've had several committees now, and they really are genuine and eager to understand the scope of the housing problems, and they are trying to just gather a deeper understanding of the needs and the solutions. So this has been really a great opportunity for the committee, but it's also been a really good opportunity for the local government leaders around the state and other members, even if they're not on the committee, but if they're a member of the delegation of the area of the state that they're visiting, to learn a lot. And it's just been a great education opportunity. So as they continue this process, it's really just their goal is to get firsthand knowledge, they say, on models that offer solutions to the housing crisis. So the testimony, the committee has heard from a very diverse range of organizations and individuals, local government leaders. The mayors have showed up, county commissioners, homeless service providers, housing developers, real estate investors, local chambers of commerce, regional economic development leaders, port authorities, land banks, habitats, the legal aids, the community action agencies, social service leaders in the communities, pretty much everyone you would expect, very diverse. It's been very thorough, and the hearings really do last a big part of the day. So people are showing up, and it'll go 4 or 5 hours. So, and what's really cool is what everybody is saying. I mean, there is definitely a common theme. We need more affordable housing. So whether it's the Chamber of Commerce leader or the mayor or the homeless service providers, everybody's talking about the need for affordable housing. So that has been very clear. And again, even though, as we talked about earlier, it's all things housing, there has definitely been more of a focus on this trending item being the lack of affordable housing. So we've heard other things connected to that as well, including development concerns with like infrastructure, NIMBY issues, zoning problems, rise in homelessness, condition issues, lack of emergency shelter funding, people on wait lists, lack of housing for individuals with disabilities. In the more rural areas, we heard from them on their concerns about not being able to access tax credit, like low-income housing tax credits, making it easier for rural communities to access those credits, all of the topics you would expect. We've also heard from numerous advocates, people with lived experience about the increase in problems with institutional investors and investors investing in mobile homes or manufactured home parks, and then hiking lot rents and really hitting people hard, especially people living on fixed incomes. So this testimony was actually really impactful. And then at a separate hearing, we heard from a legal aid lawyer who did some extensive research on institutional investors buying mobile home parks and raising rents, and just like who they are and all the numbers and the data behind it. Which was really eye-opening, and it resonated, I think, with the committee. So lots of good things happening with testimony. And on the advocacy front, we have been helping to coordinate people to show up to committee and mobilizing witnesses. I mean, it's definitely been a very diverse and broad effort. So we've, reached out to as many people as we can, put out notices and let people know, hey, they're coming to your town. We want you to show up. And then we've had like planning calls ahead of the committees, just to kind of prep witnesses, remind them what you're, how you address the chair, and just kind of those basic reminders, and reminding people too that they are the experts and that they should feel confident to go and testify and share their stories. So we've done all of that works. We haven't had like too many surprises going into each hearing, but the business community and the local government leaders, they have also brought many people together to testify as well. And I don't know, I've been particularly impressed with the mayors and the local government leaders who've participated. I think that's definitely the benefit of having a committee like go on the road and get around the state. The locals really show up, and they show up strong, and I think they're more comfortable testifying in their own backyard. So it's been really, really good. And again, the themes across this diverse stakeholder group has been very similar, and it's just basically the need for more housing options. So some of our goals, our advocacy goals from here on out, and Ryan and Kim were discussing this earlier, there's no one silver bullet. So we have a long list of recommendations, but really one of the big first steps is around education and awareness, and connecting our local constituents and local service providers directly with their legislators, and helping, build those relationships. It's still, advocacy is still about know, like, trust. So really making sure we have that relationship there, so they'll take our recommendation. So it's education, awareness. Obviously, this is a great step in the right direction. Another goal, I think, revolves around the wide variety of multi-sector partners, continuing to get them to step up and speak up. This has been very encouraging. It's been mostly the economic development sector, I would say, they've definitely showed up. So continuing to bring the other sectors to the table, health, education, we all understand those intersections, but we can't take for granted that the committee really understands those important intersections. We did have one really good witness who we've had lots of great witnesses, but this one, she worked in the schools as a homeless service liaison in the schools. And she just talked a lot about the intersection between education and, stable housing for students, and just like the details of what happens when a child doesn't have a safe place to sleep at night, and how they're able to get the child to school. And she talked about a 19-year-old who's a sophomore, and, he's struggled with housing, and she's just worries that he can't graduate. And he's already 19, he's a sophomore, and he needs to they need to keep him in school. And the way she explained it and described it, she did such a great job. I think that really resonated. So continuing to highlight all those important intersections is another effort that will continue as we move into more hearings, and hopefully as we continue to influence some of the site visits, and just really looking forward to continuing the work with this committee. So lots of good efforts, lots of good ideas that have been raised. So they've talked a little bit about, even the chair has talked about, refraining from preemptions and not getting out of her lane. They've talked a lot about restraining the predatory entities. And so our goal will hopefully to help them retain focus on the need for affordable housing. So I'll stop there, Kim. I kind of went through a lot in a short period of time, but just a positive, hopeful update from Ohio that there are, some good things going on, and hopefully we can continue our efforts with this one little committee and move it into something bigger after this. So thanks for letting me share.
Definitely. Thank you so much for joining. We love some positive updates from anywhere, and especially our wonderful state partners. So a quick question in the chat: what was the difference in response to the concept of affordable housing in the committee meetings when you talk about affordable housing in rural areas versus urban areas and suburbs?
Yeah, I think in the rural areas, both need the affordable housing. We heard, I think, more about condition issues in the rural areas. I think a little bit more that those issues came up, but also that I think the rural areas do feel a little bit left out with not being able to access help and resources because they don't have as many funds to leverage other funds, like maybe a LIHTC, and getting developers to actually go to the rural areas, I think, is harder because they don't need as much. But they also talked a lot about they don't have sewage, they don't have water, they don't have broadband. And, how are they supposed to, develop housing when they can't even get broadband access? So we didn't hear those types of issues. And even in some of like the Appalachian region of the state, I thought it was interesting that it's harder to build in the Appalachian region of the state because the landscape's just totally different. And so they have other issues too. And also in the areas that are near other states. So in the more rural areas that border other states, they can't compete all the time. So the developer is going to go to the neighboring state that might have a better situation, or that, they're going to make that business decision. So yeah, there were some differences, but a lot of the same things too, in both the rural and urban areas.
Great. Thank you so much, Gina, for joining us and for all of the excellent work you're doing for affordable housing and homelessness in Ohio. We will certainly have you all back on again to hear about, the outcome of these incredible hearings that you're holding, and keeping our fingers crossed that, all of that all that effort, all that advocacy translates into action.
Thanks, Kim.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining, Gina. So finally, we are going to turn it over to Monique Blossom, Director of Policy and Communications at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. Monique, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, Kim, thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monique Blossom. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications here at Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. We are based in New Orleans, but we serve the entire state of Louisiana and parts of the Gulf Coast as well. While the majority of our work focuses on enforcing the Fair Housing Act, I'm happy to lead a two-person policy team, and we're able to focus on broader housing issues in our work. So we are very proud to share with all of you our budget advocacy that resulted in a $22 million for housing in the 2024 New Orleans city budget. A quick breakdown of this funding is $2.5 million for our Right to Counsel program that ensures representation in eviction court for those facing evictions. $2.5 million to fully fund our new Healthy Homes program that will begin on January 1st. And lastly, $17 million into our newly created Housing Trust Fund that we created in November, just before budget season began. And those funds are mostly going to be used to build affordable housing and to start a renter-occupied rehab program. Our budget advocacy journey began just in 2022, working at the state and city level around how the American Rescue Plan dollars were being used, because we observed that these huge influxes of federal dollars were not always going to help those most negatively impacted by the COVID pandemic. And I know this is an audience that understands that ARPA dollars had a wide variety of uses, but not all of those uses really narrowed in, especially on how communities of color were disproportionately impacted negatively during the COVID pandemic. While we did not get much traction at the state level, unfortunately, I would label that as the least transparent budget process and very hard to access. We did get a lot of traction at the city level here in New Orleans. And we owe that to success to several things. In our advocacy for years, we've been reminding City Council, the mayor, and the administration that while the residents of New Orleans continually list housing as one of their top priorities, we weren't putting any of our own dollars into addressing our decades-long housing crisis. And instead relying solely on HUD grant funds that have really restricted uses. We also worked in coalition with 40 plus nonprofit and community-based organizations under the name the Big Easy Budget Coalition, and we advocated for transparency in the budget process, public input on the budget, and encouraging the city to make investments in the people of New Orleans through affordable housing, violence prevention, youth development, and community equity. We also are always building and maintaining good working relationships with the City Council, and that includes our City Council budget chair and the members who are as passionate about housing as we are. And then I think lastly, we put hard work into educating ourselves on the budget, despite it being such an opaque and difficult to access topic and process, and became budget experts in our own sense by following as much money as we could, looking for unspent dollars or slush funds, holding a lot of people accountable for hiding things, and asking a whole lot of questions of very patient City Council staff. And so moving forward, we'll be focusing on the implementation of these programs and making sure that the Housing Trust Fund money is spent timely and appropriately. Also on the horizon for us next fall, we'll be working to pass a charter amendment that will automatically put 1% to 2% of the city's budget into that Housing Trust Fund annually, guaranteeing that we're making these big investments each year. And so I reach out to all of you as colleagues, if you've worked on a campaign, if your city has passed something similar, because we will be depending on the voters to approve this charter amendment change. We would love input from there. So again, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to share this win with all of you.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Monique. You and Gina bringing the optimism, bringing the good news. Love that. That is really fantastic work. Going forward, what are you going to do next? What's going to be your next advocacy win?
Our next advocacy win, I think, is going to be that charter amendment. That's going to be a major focus for us in the upcoming year. And again, with our state legislative session starting next in the spring, we'll be advocating for some protections for formerly incarcerated people and those with criminal records, and the rental and securing rental housing. So we anticipate those wins as well.
Fantastic. Well, we will have to have you back on to give us an update when all of those wins come through. And we are certainly going to be rooting for you as this session continues.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you for joining. So finally, we will close out the call with our typical Hill update from what's going on Capitol Hill. So I'm also going to share some quick housekeeping for the new year. As folks may know, the House is on recess now throughout the rest of the year, and the Senate delayed their winter break by a week, so they are currently in session. But without the House there as well, we're not going to see any legislation finalized this year. Both the House and Senate are going to be back in session by January 9th, which just gives them 8 working days to reach an agreement on funding for FY24 for a whole slew of bills, including HUD. As folks I'm sure remember, for whatever reason, for the last continuing resolution, they divvied up. So half of the bills are going to come due on January 19th, and that includes HUD in that bucket, and the other half will come due on February 2nd. And so they only have 8 legislative days to reach a whole bunch of agreements and draft a lot of legislative text. If we're being frank, I would be very surprised if they met that deadline. Because the House and Senate are reportedly still miles apart on even a top line funding agreement for FY24, it's increasingly unlikely they're going to meet that January 19th deadline for the first batch of FY24 funding bills. House Speaker Mike Johnson has also vowed not to pass another short-term continuing resolution and is instead threatening to move forward with a year-long continuing resolution. And one thing to flag is that because, of course, of the increased cost of housing from year to year, and especially, as Sonia talked about at the top, the drastic increase in the cost of rent in recent years, a year-long CR would act as a pretty significant cut to HUD funding and would significantly reduce the number of people and communities served by HUD's vital programs. I have a little article written up that really lays out where things are currently in the continuing resolution. So please feel free to take a look at that. We are, of course, going to continue our advocacy and continue meeting with the members of Congress to push them to expand and not cut federal investments in affordable housing and homelessness services, including NLHC's priorities, which include, of course, fully funding voucher renewals, providing the Senate's proposed funding for homeless assistance grants, increased funding for public housing operations and administration, maintaining a $20 million grant for the eviction prevention grant program that was included in the Senate bill, and increased funding for tribal and native housing that was provided in the House bill. Elena just dropped a link in the chat to our Take Action page for the FY24 budget. Thank you so much, Elena. And if I could get the next slide, please, May. Thank you. So in addition to appropriations, members are also hoping to finalize a tax package that would expand the child tax credit, which has been a really crucial tool for fighting child poverty, in exchange for extending some business tax credits that are set to expire. NLIHC strongly supports an extension of the child tax credit, and we are also encouraging members to include in any tax package reforms to the low income housing tax credit, or LIHTC, that would help it facilitate construction of units affordable to people with the lowest incomes, as well as affordable housing construction in rural and tribal areas. So I'm sure a lot of folks on the call know it, but just for a little bit of background, LIHTC is the primary way in which affordable housing is built, financed in this country, which makes it a really, really vital program. But on its own, LIHTC doesn't really build housing that's deeply affordable enough for people with the lowest incomes. And as a result, over half of LIHTC tenants with extremely low incomes are still paying over half of their income on rent, despite being in a quote unquote affordable unit. So we're asking advocates to tell their members of Congress that an expansion of the low-income housing tax, or that, revisions to the low-income housing tax credit must be paired with key reforms so that the program better serves America's lowest income and most marginalized households and renters living in rural and tribal communities. My colleague Kayla has been dropping links to take action in the chat. Thank you so much, Kayla, for all of those resources. And thank you to everyone for joining us today for our last House call of 2023. We are going to be back with a new call on Tuesday, January 16th. And in the meantime, please take care of yourselves and call your members of Congress. Happy holidays to everyone and Happy New Year to you all. Wishing you and your loved ones a very safe, healthy, and happy holiday season. And until next time, take care. Thank you.